Hi again, everybody. Today we want to talk about when you should or should not negotiate on a load or try to negotiate pay for loads.
I've heard owners before, or drivers tell me that their owners have told them to negotiate on everything. Well, that just doesn't make sense because a lot of times that might lose you a load and sometimes it may lose you a good load. But then there's times where negotiating some extra money for a load, it just makes sense. I mean, you need to negotiate sometimes to make sure you're going to make a fair rate for the job that's being asked of you to do.
One thing you need to keep in mind is not every carrier you're going to be able to negotiate with. Some you can, some you cannot. So the first thing you'll need to find out is if you even are able to negotiate the pay on your loads.
Now, the key to knowing when to negotiate a load or what you need to run a load is to know what your bills are. You got to know how much you need per month to be able to
meet your expenses.
The first thing I recommend everybody do is sit down and add up all of your bills. Phone bill, house bill, rent, light bill, water bill, electricity, car payments. You add all that stuff up so you know a number that you need to make every month to be able to cover those expenses.
On top of any expenses you're going to have out on the road, not just your at-home expenses, but whether you run for an owner or not, you're going to have expenses. You may pay fuel for the truck, your owner may pay fuel, but you're going to have expenses eating out, showering.
How much do you eat? Do you go get groceries? What do you usually spend per week in groceries? Things like that. You want to add all this stuff and you want to know that number. Now, when it comes to negotiating, trying to get extra money, it all depends on where it's picking up, where it's delivering. If they're asking you to go to an area where you are going to have to empty move out, even if they pay for empty moves, a lot of these companies, all they do is pay fuel to get you back into a good area. They're not out here to run for fuel.
But not only that, yeah, it may cover the fuel, but you're also using your time, especially if you're in a straight truck or tractor trailer. You're going to have to start your clock. You're going to have to use your time to get to wherever you're going to empty move.
Absolutely.
So that's time that you're spending.
That's time off your 70-hour clock that you lose, that you're not able to do any other runs on. So those things are all taken into account when in negotiating. With most companies in expediting, when you sign on with a carrier, you sign a contract that you get a certain rate per mile. The whole goal in what you're doing is to keep that contracted rate as close to it as possible. Because if you get, let's just use the number $1.50 per mile, but then you have 20% deadhead to get to that load that pays $1.50 a mile, that 20% deadhead reduces that $1.50. So you're no longer getting $1.50. Let's say you have a 1,000-mile run that pays $1.50. That's $1,500. Now, if you had 200-mile deadhead, that all of a sudden that 1,000-mile run became a 1,200-mile run. $1,500. That just reduced your rate down to $1.25 from $1.50. So trying to get a little bit extra on the deadhead on that would be something you would want to try to do. Now, in cases where you possibly they would not agree to pay extra on the deadhead, would be if you're in a bad area and that load's taking you to a good area. That's when you don't try to negotiate extra on it. You can try, but don't let that be the set in stone, if I don't get extra on my deadhead, I'm not doing that run. Because that's still $1.25 and $1,500 you turn down to get to a better area where you might get a 2,000-mile run that pays $3,000. You got to consider where you're at and where it's going. Now, if I'm taking a load down to Laredo and they ask me to do it for a reduced rate, that's a good area. Laredo's a good area. I would not take a reduced rate out of a good area because there's going to be something else. It's almost 100% guarantee you will get something else. Now let's say I'm in Miami and they offer me a load picking up in Orlando. That's about 250 miles, I believe. And let's say the load's going 600 miles to Nashville, Tennessee. Now I'm in Miami. If I turn this load down or try to negotiate extra on that deadhead because it's not a good rate, chances are they're not going to want to pay that. So you're still going to want to go ahead and just take that load because it's getting you a load out of Miami or Orlando or Florida.
The whole goal of negotiating is trying to keep your rate per mile as close to your negotiated rate as possible. Nobody wants to run less than what their rate per mile is, but there are instances where you just have to bite the bullet and do it.
Sometimes you have to. Sometimes you have to eat those extra deadhead miles.
And knowing kind of when to negotiate and when not to negotiate is really important. You don't want to burn yourself either. Just to give you an example, what happened to us a couple years ago, we were running over Thanksgiving. We got a load, I can't even remember where it was we picked up, but it was going down to Florida, I think between Orlando and Miami.
Yep.
It was right before Thanksgiving. We had got some extra bonus money to get us back after we delivered to get back up to a better board in Georgia. So on the way down to do our delivery, dispatch called. They offered us a load picking up in Miami right after we delivered, heading to Las Vegas. Now, Jason, he tried to play hardball.
I tried to play hardball, and I tried to negotiate a bonus to get us out of Vegas down to LA. You know, my thought was that nobody's going to be running over Thanksgiving.
They would have to call back.
They would have to call back. We were playing the odds that we were their only option. Well, that burned us.
Yeah, we ended up not getting
big
the
time.
load.
That burned us big time. We didn't get the load. We ended up deadheading from Miami back up to Georgia. Then we sat for a week.
Yeah.
Until we got our next load over the holiday. Whereas if I would have just took that load, not try to negotiate any extra, I would have been running over Thanksgiving.
Plus, we still would have made that extra bonus money we had got on the run taking down there. So we still would have been ahead.
I learned from my mistakes. Trust me, that was a big mistake I made, and
it happens.
I still kick myself in the butt for that one.
Yeah.
So you don't want to negotiate on everything. The whole goal is keeping your all miles rate as close to that contracted rate that you've signed. Bonuses are needed sometimes. If you're asked to take a load to Seattle, Washington, guess what? Chances are you're going to be driving down to Sacramento or even LA, which is 1,000, 1,300 miles. Something like that. That would be a load worth losing. Even though it's a 2,500 mile load, that might be a load worth losing because chances are you're not getting out of there. You know, you're going to have to run down to LA, and if you didn't get any extra money to go down to LA, then you're basically cutting into that rate per mile, 2,500 miles that you made. So whereas $1.50 could turn into $1 per mile, all miles. We're out here to run for more than that, not $1 a mile. If we want to run for $1 a mile, we'll go to Swift and do a lease purchase and get screwed over there, you know.
I do want to add to that, though, with like what he's saying with Washington. It also depends on your carrier.
It does.
I know FedEx Custom Critical does a lot of stuff in the Northwest.
Yeah, if you're in a reefer truck.
You know, I know that they do, a lot of them do well out of there, you know. Us, on the other hand, with Panther, we didn't do well. Are we going to do well where we're going now? Possibly. You know, it's going to be a whole new ballgame. We're going to have to learn the
Here's how freight is supposed to work. If a load's going to a bad area, not a lot of drivers want it. They have to usually pay more to be able to entice drivers to take those loads for them.
And they know that.
They know that. I have no doubt carriers charge customers more rates for going into those bad areas. Yet they're taking advantage of our contracted rate and expecting us to run to that area for the same rate we would run to a good area for. That's how freight works. If it's going to a bad area, it pays more. So it can get you to the next load or get you to the next place where there is freight. Loads going to good areas, coming out of bad areas, usually pay less. That's what freight lanes are. You know, if you're able to stay within these freight lanes, deviating out of the freight lane pays less or pays more. We're in a contracted rate to run all miles like that. Now, I guess I could see the part where companies say, well, we could be paying you less going to the good areas. That's the thing you got to learn. Is it, do I take a reduced, when do I take a reduced rate? When do I ask for more money? What areas are best for my company? What areas are bad? If they're sending you a load, taking you to a really good area where it's almost guaranteed you'll get a load within hours of delivering, it might be worth taking a load 10 cents less than your contract or 15 cents less. But if it's a load taking you from a bad area to a bad area, that's not worth it. Now, I would at least want my contracted rate from a bad area to another bad area. I see it all the time where a driver is in a bad area and he's been sitting 2-3 days. He's getting anxious, you know, he needs to make some money. And he's offered another load at a reduced rate going to another bad area. He's going to have to deadhead out of there. Sure, he got that other load, and let's use $1 as an example. He got paid $1 per mile on an $800 load going to another bad area. Now he takes that load and he made $800, sure. Maybe spent $150 in fuel to complete that 800 miles, maybe $100. We'll call it $100, and so he cleared 7. He took out of a bad area to even a worse area, and now it's guaranteed he has to deadhead out of there. So he's going to have to deadhead another 800 miles or 1,000 miles. We'll call it 800 miles to get to another area where he will be able to get his next load. So that's another $100 in fuel. And sure, you might be thinking, okay, he still made $600. He's still ahead. But what you're not considering is all the maintenance those miles come with. You know, you can't just look at the upfront costs. You got to think of the whole cost of those miles. He got paid $800 to do 800 miles, but then he had to deadhead out to get to a better area, which is another 800 miles. That's 1,600 miles he just drove for $800. That just took that $1 a mile rate down to 50 cents a mile. And maybe sitting around another day would have got him a load to a better area. Now, there is no right answer to this. Sometimes you have to do things like that. Now, sometimes drivers are asking for too much money. You know, asking for full rate on deadhead for a load that only has 10% deadhead. 10% is not going to lower your full rate so drastically, whereas 40% would. The biggest part when negotiating is what's your deadhead percentage on the front end and on the back end. Always try to consider that back end deadhead too. If you're taking a load to Billings, Montana and have to deadhead to Minneapolis, that's 800 miles, but let's say that Billings, Montana load was 2,500 miles, and you pick that up right around the corner from where you dropped off. That's still quite a bit of money. Now, 2,500 mile run, sure, that's a great load. Everybody's like, oh, right, I'm gonna make $3,000. But then you have to deadhead 800 miles to get to a better area, which...
To get another load.
To get another load. So try to factor in all your deadhead miles. Know your percentage of deadhead miles versus the loaded miles and negotiate off of that. For instance, if I did a 2,500 mile run and had to deadhead 1,000 miles to get to a better area, I would try to negotiate maybe $500 to help get me back to that better area. That's going to help keep my all miles rate as close to my contracted rate as possible. Mm-hmm. Now, anytime you're trying to negotiate to keep it at or higher, you may be burning yourself. Another thing to consider is when dispatch calls you about another driver who's broke down. This is a tough one. They're asking you to do a load, recover a load to help another driver out. Negotiations on these type of loads is a lot of times it comes back on the original driver and he may have to pay that. Try to be a little helpful on those kind of loads where you're helping another driver out, because you may be in that same position one day where you broke down and you needed help from another driver to come pick that load up and complete it. And if he's asking for a bunch of money and that's the company's only option to do and they have to pay it, it could come back and burn you. Anytime I'm negotiating on a load to help another driver who's broke down, I always try to be mindful. Now, if it's going to a bad area, I won't take it or it's got to pay, but you got to be mindful of that.
Another thing you want to think about when negotiating is be flexible. You want to be flexible with what you're asking for. You know, you may ask for X amount of dollars and the dispatcher comes back, well, we can't give you this, but we can give you that. You know, you've got to have in your mind the lowest you're going to want to go. That may work for you, it may not. You know, you've got to know, am I willing to run for that or am I not willing to run for that? Ultimately, it's your decision. But you don't want to be, like Jay said, too greedy either, because then it can come back and bite you. You may just miss out on the load totally, especially when you're in an area and there's a lot of drivers. If there's a lot of other drivers there, chances are they're just going to say, well, no, well, we can't do that, and they're going to go on to the next driver, and you've lost that load.
Yep.
So that's something to keep in mind, too, when you're negotiating.
Yep, and try to work with them, you know. If you know how to figure out your all miles rate, you can explain that to them, because a lot of dispatchers don't understand that all miles rate. You have 50% deadhead and how that's going to affect your loaded miles. And sometimes if you explain it to them, hey, if I run this load for what you're offering, I'm going to be at 90 cents a mile. That's a low rate for a straight truck, you know. Maybe they'll understand it more and be like, okay, well, let's try to get you up to at least all miles $1.20 or something. $1.20 ain't horrible, you know. I mean, plus fuel surcharge, that's doable. But we've been offered loads where the all miles rate would have put us at 90 cents a mile, and we're not out here to run for that. We'll post a link. I did a video on this, on how deadhead affects your loaded miles. Look at the big picture. When they call you with the load, see if it's going to a good area. If it's not going to a good area, see where you're going to have to move next to get to a good area. How many miles is that distance? How many deadhead miles do you have? All those extra miles on top of the loaded miles, negotiate on that. That's what you're trying to work on, because you're getting paid the loaded miles. Now, if you're going to have a bunch of extra added deadhead and relocation miles on top of that load, that's what you're negotiating on. Try to keep that up to like $1 a mile if you can. Probably no less than 75 cents a mile.
I'm really surprised at how many drivers there are out here that don't even know what they're running for. They don't know how to figure out.
They think, oh, I'm getting $1.50 a mile. That's what my contract is. When you deadhead 40%, that $1.50 just became $1.20 or $1.15. So I hope this helps kind of explain when to negotiate and kind of figure out what you're running for. If you guys have any questions, or if I confused you at all with any of this, please get a comment down below or send us an email. I'd be more than happy to try to help explain it. We'll link a couple other videos we did down below of how deadhead affects your rate per mile, and the good and bad freight areas. I think those are really two important videos that most people should watch. They really explain, you know, good freight lanes, good states to go to, bad states to go to, and how that deadhead affects your loaded miles.
Thank you all so much for watching and subscribing, and until our next video, peace, love, and expediting.